Welcome to Trinity Place in Geneva, New York, for this third Sunday of the Pentecost season. My name is Cameron Miller. Welcome. This is a reflection on readings for this third Sunday. Luke 9:51 through 52, and there's a great Rita Dove poem, which I don't remark on, but if you want to read a great poem, Dawn Revisited by Rita Dove. I'll start with this. Don't you love euphemisms? Check out that first line in the Gospel of Luke, which says, when the days drew near for him to be received up. By received up, Luke must have meant tortured, stripped naked, and nailed to a cross. Received up does in fact sound a little better. So this little series of dark sayings from Luke is positioned at the hinge of Luke's gospel, in which Jesus turns away from the rural areas where he is well known and popular, and toward Jerusalem, the holy city, where messiahs like him were a dime a dozen and ended up as goo on the bottom of a Roman sandal. Both Matthew and Luke have the sayings that we heard today, while Mark and John do not. The theory is that Matthew and Luke had a common source of Jesus' sayings and stories that Mark, being the earliest gospel, didn't have. Who knows? But these sayings are hard to contend with. I'm going to read them to you, or at least some of them. Starting at 9:59. To another Jesus said, "Follow me." But he said, "Lord, first let me go bury my father." But Jesus said to him, "Let the dead bury their own dead. But as for you, go and proclaim the kingdom of God." Another said, "I will follow you, Lord, but let me first say farewell to those at my home." Jesus said to him, "No one who puts hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God." So this strikes me as warrior talk. That is, the Jesus who knew that there was a target on his back and was dodging Roman troops' patrols. Jesus, the warrior, who found himself up against it and needed to know whoever was with him had his back. Forget about those who have already been killed, Jesus might have said. And forget about your mom and your dad, because you probably won't ever see him again anyway. Well, that said, I'm not certain there ever was a Jesus the warrior. But the kind of rhetoric Luke has coming out of Jesus' mouth is not an everyday kind of banter. But let me just say that I realize that I talk about Jesus a lot from week to week, and I don't know any more about Jesus than you do. And I know you know that, but I just need to say it once in a while, especially when I'm going to yammer on some more about Jesus. Now, I probably read more about Jesus in the gospel commentaries and whatnot than many of you do, but talking about Jesus and what Jesus said and what Jesus thought and what Jesus did is an educated guessing game. And anyone who pretends otherwise is a delusional lout, not to put too fine a point on it. That said, I'm going to go back to talking about Jesus. So here's my take on the gospel today. The Jewish primal narrative, almost from day one, was torn apart by dueling traditions. There was the purists on the one hand and the prophets on the other, the prophet on the other. Jesus was a prophet. Purists, represented by the priestly class, saw the world as a set of God-given rules. Keep those rules and all is well. Break those rules and all is lost. When the rules were broken, then there were more rules for repairing the fracture. Every offense had a prescription, and every prescription had a secondary solution. It was a very tightly constructed world built like interlocking Legos with a hierarchy of rules. The prophetic tradition saw the world differently. The prophetic vision was of a human landscape that operates within a standard of equality, where goods and services should be distributed evenly, and the good guys lead while the bad guys get punished and then reformed. The prophetic can be infected with the purity virus also, but often the very rigidity of the purity faction acted as its own corrective in the prophetic tradition. Rather than all the rules and whatnot, the prophetic tradition, to put it generally, globally, was that God allows us to suffer the consequences of our own behavior. Jesus the prophet was a peasant. He was impoverished by circumstance, not by choice. That makes a huge difference. We are told by the Gospel of Mark that Jesus lived in Capernaum, that Jesus had a house, and he likely had some kind of business in his house, at least before he became a preacher. Jesus also had some friends who had more means than he did, friends who funded his public ministry. Lazarus, Martha and Mary, and perhaps others must have had provided capital to supplement whatever collections were taken at his sermons. We don't often think about how Jesus was funded, but it's worth thinking about because he was in some way, despite what the Gospel of Luke says today. Now, as you may remember, I spent a little over a decade as a regular visitor to El Salvador. And on one of those visits, I went to a church with over 150,000 members. The pastor and his son, who was also a co-pastor, held 10 services each weekend, each service with 10,000 people in attendance. It was quite amazing, really, because all along the streets on every side of the compound were our vendors selling food, beverages, and clothing from carts and booths. The market's not there during the week, and it's a shady residential neighborhood. But on the weekend, shady as in shade, leafy trees. But on the weekend, it becomes crammed and jammed in this mismatch of commercial enterprise. The pastors showed us the church's spreadsheet for the month of June, and each week the collection was $70,000 to $100,000. I wonder how our June's going. Now, that's roughly $5 million a year collected from extremely poor people. Attending one of those services, I witnessed people putting quarters in baskets. So $5 million, a few quarters and dollars at a time. When Jesus drew a crowd, his disciples also probably passed the hat. Now, I wish I could get a quarter for every time someone visits our website or Facebook page or YouTube channel. Jesus is so often depicted as this sweet, lamb-holding shepherd who wandered through the world healing and making nice to everybody he met, a kind and a haphazard ministry that ended up with him mistakenly crucified. Not likely. Jesus was an organizer. Jesus was an organizer, and he was strategic. He was a reformer with an agenda, and he probably had some pretty lofty goals. He was also notorious for breaking the purity rules. It's hard for me to imagine Jesus dining with a Roman collaborator one day, a tax collector, for instance, who made his money by demanding imperial taxes and extorting extra for himself, And then the next day, rebuking a would-be follower for wanting to go say goodbye to his parents. I'm betting that was Luke's editorial bias, but I could be wrong. But herein is the problem for us. Jesus becomes a purity figure even though he was a prophet. Jesus is this huge canvas upon which we project our own desires and beliefs and hopes. Whether it's Luke's projection of a militant healer, or my projection of a reform-minded organizer, or Paul's projection of an eternal Christ figure, or somebody else's projection of a standard bearer for moral purity, we do not get to know the original Jesus. Nobody, nowhere, anytime gets to know that Jesus. When it comes to Jesus, there is no purity. Now, within Christianity, the purity parties have captured Jesus and imprisoned him under glass so that he is now a litmus test for their purity and for divine acceptance. Meanwhile, Jesus' prophetic vision languishes in domesticated Christian churches that have become a pillar of class and culture, or purveyors of American nationalism. Too often, when America looks at Jesus in the 21st century, it sees itself and its own aspirations. It does not see the prophet, and instead sees the silhouette of its own standard for purity. It does not hear a vision of equitable distribution. It hears justification for individuality and a prosecutor for private property and gun ownership. If I were to tell you that Jesus was in fact an evangelist of basketball and a passionate partisan of the Boston Celtics, you would rightly dismiss it as bunk. And yet, the Jesus we hear in the public square these days in America is as ridiculous and a lot more dangerous. Whatever Jesus we want to espouse needs to be reconciled with the soil in which Jesus is rooted. Standing alongside Jesus must be the ancient vision born on Mount Sinai, handed down to Moses, and Moses to Joshua, and Elijah to Elisha, and Ruth to Naomi, and Elizabeth to Mary, and Peter to Paul, and all the way down to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and from Bonhoeffer to Martin Luther King Jr. It is a vision to be debated, to be interpreted, to be argued, to be shaped over time, in every time. It's not a vision to be prescribed or force-fitted or purified. So where does that leave us? Now, obviously, if you ask somebody else, you'd get a different response than the one I have. My take is this. While I wouldn't go so far as to say the concerns of the purity gang are irrelevant and retrograde, I will say that they are not that we are not a purity institution. Not if we hold Jesus as the central teacher of our movement. Rather, we are meant to be a prophetic movement. Now that's a pretty big umbrella, I realize, and doesn't narrow it down too much. One of the questions we face as a spiritual community here is, what kind of spiritual community are we? Now I'm guessing, based on my experience with the people at Trinity Place and many of the people of those of which I've met from online, that we do not have a lot of difficulty choosing between the purity faction and the prophetic tradition. But it's the next step that we need to take. And we will be taking that step this summer here at Trinity Place, but this goes to all of us. The vestry here is gearing up for a mission development retreat and inviting the whole congregation to take part in that, date to be announced. What kind of prophetic community are we? We have been using 3 separate little taglines the past 7 years here, none of which were voiced by the whole community. One is open, inclusive, and challenging. Another one has been to say that we are a spiritual community in the tradition of the Episcopal Church. And finally, on our windows, we declare that Trinity Place is an open space for growth, healing, wellness, and the arts. Clearly, we here at Trinity Place are some kind of hybrid, a new creature on the evolutionary tree of the Jesus movement. But what kind? What are our core values? And this is where it comes to all of us, whether you're a member of Trinity Place or whatever community you're part of. What are our core values? What do we name as the most important things we do or aim to do? What would diminish us beyond recognition if we could not do it? These are questions every community, and certainly every spiritual community, must ask itself. And must ask itself in every generation. We are the new generation here in the life of Trinity Church Geneva. Unlike Luke, I believe we are allowed to turn our faces back and remember, even as we move forward with the plow, digging up and planting the future. I also believe that we can bury the dead and grieve them too, while still being faithful to our newness. And I do believe that we can go home and say goodbye to whoever it is or whatever it is that we're going to be leaving behind, while still being fully engaged as a new kind of community in the Jesus movement. But if we hover too long or too much on the past or on our grief, Jesus will challenge us to stop it and to keep on moving on. Now, if you ask me, and I realize you didn't, I would say that every single one of us was commissioned as a little prophet when we were baptized. Our task now as a community is to nurture and to challenge each other in that little prophet ministry. As individuals, our task is to engage with the community and nurture and challenge the community forward, because being prophetic is a community movement. It's not an individual enterprise. So while we were baptized to become little prophets, Christian spiritual practice is not something individuals do, it's what a community does. The individuals within the community are its gifts, are its charisms that shape what and how the community practices. That's why we're a movement rather than something that was. Thank you so much for being part of this and being with us. I wish you peace.